This is Colonel in honor of Colonel Womberg, U.S. Army, apparently Pentagon Rhodes Scholar, things of that sort. I actually do have a design because you can sell corn to China. It's like this. I'm not gonna say it's the same to them. It's kind of like the same to them. Rice. It's gonna be a longer. This isn't gonna make it into the short. No, it's record most likely because it's a design conversation. So it denotes it demands, one could say, uh, a slightly longer conversation and explanation, including specific designs. Okay, these are some of the things I think about. I may not agree with some portions of science, but a large portion of science, I, it's, it, you know, uh, some sciences are more grounded than others, so to speak. Um, in other words, uh, design of a farm. Okay, let's say you're globally competitive. Back in the George Bush, not the George Bush days, but the George Bush days. He was the senior to George Bush. Yeah, not George Bush Jr., the dude from Texas who his parents happened to be billionaires and was a smart guy. He did go to the fancy schools, but whatever. This is not George Bush, but just George Bush, original one. The only guy I ever voted for. I didn't vote ever in my life. I did vote one time when I was in college, something like that. I was 18 or 19 years old. I took a year off after high school. Ran a small enterprise, and but I did vote for George Bush. I think I voted for George. Maybe I voted for George Bush. I would have voted. I was too young to vote for George Bush. Something like that. Anyways, at the time, my mother was she was a reader of biographies and other factual based books about people's lives, amongst other things. And one of the books she had around was a book by I think it was an autobiography or about Alan Greenspan. And I used to skim through that book as a really young child. My father's line, I went through his bookshelf all the time, reading quantum physics books like Stephen Hawking's, but I rarely talked about some of my mother's books, including the autobiography of Alan Greenspan. I later found out, 30 years later, something like that, almost 25 years later, that Alan Binder was second in command, and a Yale professor served. There was two Allens. Okay, Alan Binder. He had this economic theory, a drunkard walking around in a street light, a street lamp. He talked about supply side economics rather than demand side. So the most of the American foundational economic theory was founded and based in since about the 1950s, 60s, and definitely 70s, and maybe even up to the 80s, in the demand side. In other words, people wanted stuff, things, because new technologies were burgeoning. Markets were still relatively archaic compared to what they are today, things of that sort. So Alan Binder may have been slightly more accurate in his thinking, but the people themselves didn't have the economy itself was still early in its life cycle of economic theory. Now, with that being said, why did I mention that? Well, because people say, well, why would you want to increase crop yield? So this technically is about a design of a modern farm, how to increase potentially the crop yields upwards potentially of more than 1,000%, okay, or 1,300%, or upwards of 1,500%. And you say that's impossible. What are you doing to and potentially gaining market share against other commodities, significant market share, upwards of an order of impact of maybe upwards of 10%. Okay. So with cost effectiveness, it's really not that complicated. Now, you don't want to be causing earthquakes because they have these drilling machines that drill down. It's the design of farms. It's a lot of farmland, more more land you could possibly manage. Would take a really, really long time. And people infrastructure, generalistically speaking, take precedence over the business infrastructure of farms. But for some farmers that have an interest in some things, they could potentially start doing some of this research. You could even invest in my companies, and because I've thought of these things on some people's behalf. If you use a drill to drill down under earth, and you have the farmland underneath the ground, you put some solar panels and some lights. That's kind of obvious. You get a crop yield. You have the ventilation going through and things like that, and things of that sort. Then you have the actual layer that exists right now on top of the land, and then the third layer exists. Well, how would you do it? Well, you could separate carpet, sturdy carpet. The one underneath, they have a little like net underneath the actual carpet. And then what you would do is that you would have small water towers stationed. This is how you would deliver the water towers to the farmland. Before the crop starts to grow in the springtime, you would take heavy, large, maybe C-130s or whatever type of airplanes, and hoist small miniature water towers, concrete underneath. Drop it down into the ground, right? In various locations. Let's say it's a 100-acre farm or a 10-acre farm or a 1-acre farm or whatever. It's depending on the level of experiment. So then, the water itself will be more easily accessible to the crops up above, things of that sort. You can spray guns on the water towers. There's a bunch of different ideas. You could mist it every day. The crops would get significant more rainfall. It would be more predictable rain itself to the actual crops, much more predictable. And does that make sense? And so you'd be able to know the exact hydration rates of crops, because right now they're relying on weather patterns, and trying to predict accurately or inaccurately what kind of weather it's going to be based on a limited amount of statistical data, less than 130 or 140 years of Farmer's Almanac knowledge sets of planet Earth's weather systems and weather patterns. There's a company called WeatherTech on the way up to Chicago that may be interested in this idea. I'm not for sure. Or in the generalized research of the AG research centers in various states, including Illinois and other states as well. Okay. So you could build the interwoven whatever farmland on top in different ways, but you basically build a bridge, a low-cost bridge up above, and you go crops 3 levels deep. Okay. Pesticides. Right now, they're using all kinds of chemicals in foodstuffs, reducing the nutritional quality of things on an infinitum. There's lots of research that suggests these things. The nitrogen content in the soil is a problem. Why? Because there's literally not enough feces in the soil. The wildlife has not roamed the farmlands for upwards of 50 to 60 generations, so they have to artificially nutrient to the corn and things like that. So it becomes depleted. That's the reason why they cycle every 7 or 8 years, or they used to cycle soybeans over the corn. They used to do these kinds of things. So, for greater crop yields and also healthier crop yields and things like that. So I mean, it's like, well, how are you supposed to deliver what are you supposed to do? Call up China and say, hey, look, we need 4 tons of feces for the crops in Illinois, because it's the soil itself is lacking in nutrients or something like that. It's complicated. It's not really that complicated. It's fairly obvious. Okay. How you would deliver various nutrients, if it's synthetic nutrients, perhaps would be through a small network of drones. Here at Automation Anytime, we can build low-cost drones and things like that. And you would basically shoot or just drop little chemical things along the network at various levels. Use small drones at just above at every level. Does that make sense? And of course, so that's if just from square footage alone, you increase the yield by 200% just through construction, basically design and construction of and with having water located at various places. The hydration, the yield itself of the land may be increased upwards of 10 to 15 to 20% by misting the corn consistently. And that way you can choose a fertilizer and or growth or bug inhibitor more effectively, rather than just relying on a limited amount of statistical weather data, basically. Then of course the middle and bottom layer would be more predictable, because the top layer could actually inhibit an overconsumption of watering. That's just potentially just as much of a problem potentially as underhydration, underhydration. Does that make sense? So these water towers could technically also capture the water that's being the rain that's falling from the clouds. If it's based in other cornfields, may have different chemicals in the clouds. Does that make sense? So who knows what chemicals are actually raining in? It does cleanse the rain meagerly. I don't work at an AG lab or anything like that, so I don't really know, but that would be my guess. It's a reasonable guess. Then of course, what you do after that is that the water itself, from a molecular standpoint, may not be as pure as it could be. So, for example, if you combine Enagic Kangen water machines or other water purification systems, it changes the molecular structure of the water. So, the water itself, the hydration of the crops themselves become more hydrated, requiring less water, most likely because the hydration rates, and that also saves money of water expense. The network of water towers could be hooked together through a small, basically building a pipeline a water pipeline for farmlands. And so what you could do is you could take it to, there's almost 8.5 billion people on planet Earth. You could start selling more commodities of your commodity to foreign countries at a more predictable rate. Things of that sort. So just think about it. And my name is Andrew C. Graham. I'm with Automation Anytime Pending Inventions, Design and Build, Peoria-Illinois.com, things of that sort. Anyways, thanks for listening.